applications of phylogenetics workshop. I think today will be a much simpler concept, I hope, to digest. But what we'll talk next to us is how to understand trait evolution in a phylogenetic framework. All of us at some point or the other have thought about traits. Could it be phenotypic, morphological traits which we measure using specimens, observe traits? It could be behavioral trait like frogs call, crickets call, or bird call, or their actual behavior. How do they feed, feeding behavior, etc. Or ecological or functional traits, which are thought to be a response to certain adaptations. And people have been thinking about these traits for a long time, and there are two very distinct ways to think about traits. Traits could be, when you see a trait in a species, it could be a legacy of history. That means their ancestor also had and they inherited that trait from an ancestor. Or it could be actual an adaptation to an environment, a physiological adaptation, anatomical adaptation, or behavioral adaptation. So trying to understand how traits evolve, one can classify into either historical factors or non-historical factors. And can we now use actually phylogenies to understand how a particular trait might have evolved? So it's a very straightforward understanding or thinking that phylogeny, which gives you an hypothesis how species are related to one another. And the basic workshop, you went over this to actually reconstruct trees where species will, you'll know the relationships. Can we now look at how association of certain traits or a trait value and its distribution on a phylogeny? And using this, can we try and understand how those traits might have evolved? Given this is the evolutionary tree for a group of species, and these are the trait values which we see today, can we try and understand what might have caused those certain traits presence in those species? And this particular whole field of trait evolution, one can ask multiple questions. I'm just going to list out a couple of them. And they come into this broad umbrella of phylogenetic comparative methods. One is actually reconstructing the ancestral traits, like how we reconstructed biogeographic areas using historical biogeography methods. One could look at the trait evolution patterns if there is a phylogenetic signal. More closely related species have a similar trait values versus distinctly related species. Or on the other hand, very distinctly related species have a same trait value, is a example of convergent evolution. One can actually think about rates of trait evolution, how traits are evolving and what is the rate of that particular trait, like a beak length, for example, can be studied. One can look at how the trait interacts with one another. Does beak length and a feeding habit are always related? Once your feeding habit changes, your beak length changes, beak shape changes, something like that. Are the traits correlated with one another? Or how those traits per se influence the speciation and diversification within a group. And this is a much more recent area in which the methods are still developing, and one can think about Bissey, the binary species models, or there's another set of models called BAM, again Bayesian mixed models, in which you can use these traits to understand how they have impacted speciation and diversification within a group. Again, one can think of any trait which has a functional advantage. In today's class, what we will focus on is only looking at the ancestral reconstruction of traits. Because the other things one can think are there in a book called Phylogenetic Comparative Methods. If anybody is interested, I can send a copy of that book. But today's next 1 hour, 1.5 hours, what we'll focus is on how to understand trait evolution using phylogeny. Phylogeny could also need not be a fixed phylogeny. You can have multiple phylogenies with different relationships. But it's a starting point for any comparative method, and then think about what are the phenotypic traits you are interested in understanding their evolution. So to give you an example, this is the phylogeny. We have 16 species, and now I have a trait value. It could be any trait, as we mentioned. It could be behavioral, phenotypic, morphological trait. How is the trait value distributed on a phylogeny? So imagine these are 16 species and these are 16 trait values. I have color coded them, suggesting all 1 to 8 species have a blue color trait and 9 to 16 are red color trait. So it's a similar trait value. In this very simplistic example, we can think that a trait might have evolved here, which is the common ancestor for species 1 to 8, and similarly 9 to 16 must be somewhere here. It's a very simple scenario, and you don't necessarily get these scenarios when we work with the real data sets. But this is how we are interested in understanding, if we have a trait value, we have a phylogeny, how that trait evolution might have happened. And I'll try and give you a couple of examples how people have done this, and then go over the methods, and then present one case study from our own work. So this is a phylogeny of bumblebees based on mitochondrial and nuclear markers, and all of you are now familiar how to get a species tree for any group. So imagine this is a tree of bumblebees, and now the authors here are interested in understanding how communal brood rearing, which is a very important trait for bumblebees, has evolved in this group. So now they map that particular trait across this bumblebee phylogeny, and they show it's the ancestral trait here, which is marked in green. And now all these bumblebee species have retained that trait. It's not like it has evolved independently on every single lineage. It's an ancestral trait. Then they look at one more trait. How are the parasitic bees have evolved? Are they also from one particular group? You can think of a scenario where all these 3 species which are parasitic form one group. But that's not the case. The red stars mark here all the parasitic bees, and it has evolved 3 independent times. Right? Again, this is a very simple scenario. It's a binary character, parasitic or non-parasitic, communal brood rearing or not. And you can see now 3 times independently parasitic behavior has evolved, but communal brood rearing was an ancestral trait for the bee phylogeny. This is an example of orioles, and the authors here were interested in understanding how the migratory behavior has evolved in the group of orioles. So it's a group oriole phylogeny here. And what you see is the different kinds of migratory patterns these orioles show. So the white is sedentary, which don't migrate. Partial migratory is in blue, short distance in yellow, and long distance in red. And equivocal is after reconstruction. Can we actually assign any of these traits to their ancestor, or is it equivocal, which means both ancestral states are equally possible? So as you could see here, there are pairs of short and long distance migration, which are 3, right? There are 2 species, one species which shows short distance, one species which shows long distance. But all partial migratory species here again, here, there's one here and one here, have evolved independently. So there's a multiple instances of gain of short and long distances, but there is no directionality, like first you show partial, then you show short or long distance. These are very independent events. So this information can also get once you have a species level phylogeny for a group. Another scenario one could think is that the sister species here, can you see my cursor, could have been partial, and then one could have thought first partial and then short and a long distance species, but that's not the case. Partial behavior has evolved independently twice, and then there are the species pairs which show short and long distance migration. And these are their ancestral reconstruction to see if their ancestor had this character, but they didn't. All ancestors were sedentary, and this has evolved in that particular lineage. Now the third example is of flowers, and this is the molecular phylogeny of Anonaceae, one of the primitive families of plants. And here the authors were interested in understanding syncarpy, which is a fusion of carpels, and how that particular thing has evolved, and which has been shown here in this green box, how the origin of syncarpy has happened. And they show that syncarpy originated by congenital fusion of this moderate number of carpels. And it's like presence of number of carpels is the ancestral state. So the characters which were mapped is number of carpels and how that has particularly evolved. And only in this clade you see syncarpy, which is the fusion. Another trait using the same phylogeny which they use is the liana to woody plants. So lianas are these woody climbers. So how within this Anonaceae family, how the liana as a habit for that particular group of plants has evolved. Most of the plants are woody, but some are woody climbers. And again, the red stars here show whenever that transition has happened. And these gray circles show like how it has. It's again independently, 3 lineages show that reversal from liana to woody plants, but the rest of the clade is a liana. Another example is from geckos. It's little looking at the toe pads. So the family of a gecko here, all the red ones here, can you see here the adhesive toe pads, leaf toe pads, which are in blue, and third category, paraphalanges, which is in gray. And now they are interested in understanding how these particular traits have evolved in gecko phylogeny. So here, important point I want to say that this is done at a genus level, and they had out of 118, 107 genera. So important point while we think about these traits, whatever unit you are using in your phylogeny has a consistently similar trait value. It could be a family, genus, or a species, but the trait value within that group is consistent. It doesn't vary much, and that becomes your unit of analysis. So here you could say how adhesive toe pads have evolved. And if one counts, they have evolved 11 independent times and have lost 9 times. So these kind of information one can gather by doing ancestral trait reconstruction. So what sort of hypothesis? So these were few examples of using continuous or discrete or binary traits. So one can test, as we saw, multiple hypotheses using these methods. You can look at phylogenetic conservatism or convergence. Has it independently evolved or is it shared ancestry? Polarity or directionality, like short and long distance, do they always evolve from partial migration or not? How is the polarity or directionality of that particular character change? Or is it association of 2 or more characters, which we'll talk about in another example? Or evolutionary patterns processes from pattern in a comparative data, just that what sort of patterns of a trait has in a given taxa. And how does one go about actually reconstructing the history? So there are multiple methods. You can use parsimony, likelihood, and Bayesian methods. Today I'll explain in detail parsimony and I'll very briefly mention likelihood, but one can use Bayesian approach again to do this character trait evolution. The software which allows you to do that is Mesquite. Mesquite does all 3, parsimony, likelihood, and Bayesian. In R, you can do likelihood and Bayesian. And there's another software called Bayes Traits, which also allows you to do likelihood and Bayesian approach. As we have seen, there is a discrete data set, which is binary 0, 1, or you can have a multi-state, like short, long, partial migration, or presence absence data, or you can have a continuous. These are the measurements. You can have size, shape, physiological state, any continuous trait you can think of. One thing to keep it in mind is that binary data are easy, or multi-state data are easy to think about, but discretized continuous traits or categories, one needs to think about what is the meaningful bin for one of these criteria, as well as if you need to do any for a continuous state, any transformation for the data. If it's not following, what sort of distribution is appropriate? Do you need to log transform or not? Once you figure out those, if you have a categorical data, what are the bins? If it's a discrete data, straightforward. Or do you need to transform your continuous data? What is the trait value you will actually plot? Do you have any questions so far? Sorry, because I can't see my chat box right now. So if you have, just stop me and then I can
Yeah,
go
so
over
if
it.
you have any questions, please unmute and ask.
For trait study, we have to use the mitochondrial gene only or some other genes?
No. So for a trait evolution, what you are using is a phylogeny. and phylogeny will come independently of your trait. So you can use either mitochondrial nuclear data to reconstruct your tree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you have to have a very robust phylogeny. That's the prerequisite for any of these applications. Yeah, shall I go ahead? I didn't see any.
Yes, yes.
There are no questions on the chat box. I'll
Cool.
let you know in case there are.
Sure. So I'll move on to the methods. So first I'll discuss the parsimony approach. All of you must be remembering parsimony principle from phylogeny reconstruction, right? And that principle remains same. Our aim here is to what are the minimum steps involved to get to the current character state on the phylogeny. So that same parsimony principle will apply here. So right now the method which I will describe is called Fritz-Wagner parsimony algorithm, but you can use multiple algorithms to do this. It's one of the simplest approach. As I mentioned, fewest evolutionary steps or transitions between characteristics is what we will optimize. And branch lengths here are not incorporated in this approach. So imagine you have 5 species A, B, C, D, E, and these solid and empty circles are your character states. Yeah, so it's a binary character. You can think about present and absence. My aim here is, if I look at D and E, what would have been the ancestral character? Equal, half of the empty circle, half full circle. Then I move on to the next ancestor, which is G for F and C. 2 black, 1 empty circle. Most common state is black. I put it here. Now I look at G as a node, and then B. Again, 1 empty, 1 black. Both are equal. Then H and A. Look at 2 empty circle, 1 black circle. So the state for I node becomes empty circle. This is called down pass. And now I do up pass optimization. Now I look at H and A. What is the H when I do up pass optimization? 2 empty, 1 black. What's the most common state? To get this is empty circle. Then this versus B. For G, node G, it becomes empty circle. Then I look at G, sorry, F and C, and then what's the most common circle? I put it at F. So this is called up pass. So what we did, we went from tip to the ancestors and now from ancestor to the tip. So it's called up pass optimization. And what you have is something called final optimization. So I remains empty circle. Then we take.
Ma'am, could you just repeat it once again, the pass?
Sure. So do you want me to tell? Sorry, already answers are there. There's no animation here. But if I start from H and look at A, is the empty circle, right? Then I look at G and B. Then I look at F and C. And then what is the minimum steps involved to explain that particular ancestor state? And ultimately, I average. I remains empty circle. What is the average? 2 empty, 1 black. More dominant is 2 of those are empty circles, so I keep it here. Then I have half. One is black, one is empty, which remains here, which is equivocal. Then you have 2 black, 2 white, which again remains here. So this is your final optimization. So when you look at in Mesquite, what you will see, the ancestral trait here is empty circle, equivocal, right? So this is the very simple way to imagine how the ancestral character optimization is done using parsimony principle. Everyone clear? Yeah, I'm assuming everyone.
Yeah, there are no
understood.
questions on the chat box.
Yeah.
Yeah, somebody
No
has.
questions, but I think talking more about it should clear it out. I think.
What do you mean?
I mean, not very clear. But yeah, I think it should work out well once we see the examples about it or something.
So have you understood the idea, how it's been done? So you
Yeah,
have
yeah,
your trait
yeah,
values at
yeah,
the tips,
Yes,
and you are
yes.
yeah,
interested what are the trait values now, potential trait values, possible trait values at the ancestral nodes. So if I use parsimony principle, which involves fewer steps to explain the trait value. So to explain the trait value at D and E node, what is the most optimal trait value at their ancestor? And to do this, we did something called down pass and up pass optimization and said it's equivocal. We did the same exercise for ancestral node G, H, and I. And what is the most number of steps? So when I say I here, there is no step here, right? When I say empty circle at H, there are no steps here. When you have empty and black circle at G, you invoke equivocal, but there's no empty circle here, right? So there are only two transitions here. And one can think about more complex scenarios and optimize the trait value, right? It's equal. The ancestral could have empty or black circle here at this node. And that's
Okay,
the
so
aim here. Yeah.
Janvi, I just so there's another equally parsimonious reconstruction possible here, right? Where I and H remain white, remain open, which is what this reconstruction has come up with, and then there is a transition to black at G and F, and then a reversal to white at E.
Yes, but that involves two steps, no?
That involves two steps, and even this involves two steps, right? This is a transition from white to black and white at G, and it remains black and white at F, and then it reverts back to white along E.
Yes, but when you say equivocal, I think there are no steps then. Like when I say it's 50-50, I know it's two steps to get to what current states are, but you are not talking about with confidence about G and F node. You are saying it's 50-50. It could be white or empty. It's equivocal. Is it making any sense?
yeah, yeah, clear now. Thank you.
No, Praveen, does this make sense when you keep it as equivocal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, and again, other alternate parsimony methods, which are irreversible Dolo or step metrics, are available to do this optimization, but Mesquit doesn't use any of them at this moment. It uses the Fish-Wagner algorithm, but these methods are also available. Then we can very briefly discuss what's the limitation. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't incorporate the branch length, how species are related to one another, which will be depicted in these branch length and the distance. And also if you have a time tree, it will be time taken to have that particular trait transition. So that's how likelihood and Bayesian methods came into picture. And people started thinking, can we actually incorporate branch length? Then we can think about the rate and have a distance also between the species and time. You can use continuous and discrete trait for likelihood approach. Model of trait evolution. You have to select again an appropriate model. For right now, discrete trait, I think there's only one MK model which is available. But you can also use something called, rather likelihood approach uses something called Markov models for trait evolution. And I'm sure you have heard this word Markov in understanding the basic phylogenies. So it's the same Markov models which doesn't use while reconstructing what was the prior information given or a prior state it had. So it uses something called continuous time Markov models of trait evolution. What it means, Markov models are used for a random processes. You don't assume anything, any directionality in which the probability of change from a state black to empty circle depends only on that particular current state. There's no prior information what its ancestor may have had. Every time you're doing that transition, it's only looking at those current states. There's no information on the prior state change on any branches. And if you have a binary trait, you have two states, 1 or 0, empty or black circle. Then at any point in time, the chance to shift a character is 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, right? Empty to black, black to empty circle, because you have only two characters to think about. And then you obtain something called rate parameters, which will give you the highest likelihood score for all possible reconstructions. As Praveen also said, there are two possible reconstructions using that parsimony. Now here, what we'll look at is these two transitions. We'll optimize them using likelihood method, and we'll look at what is the highest likelihood among those multiple scenarios construction, given this is the tree topology. These are the branch length. What are the most likely transitions of these trait values given the tree? So again, to just reiterate, the probability of change at any point in time along any branch tree depends only on the character state at that time. There is no information consider what the ancestor has or what the tips has. Only information of a character stage at that particular node. Transitions along each of these branches are independent. So for example, two sister species D and E had one trait change. Similar trait change can happen along those branches, and that doesn't have an influence how you are viewing other trait changes. They are independent. Again, this particular method assumes that rate change are constant throughout the time and along the branches, and many people are working on this assumption, which we all know it may not hold true, and there are methods which now incorporate rate heterogeneity. But right now, what model we are looking at does not. It just assumes this rate change, 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, it's constant. It can happen, it's independent of anywhere in the branch it happens, and on any branch, it's an equal likelihood. Rates are estimated only from the tree which you give along with the branch length. So this is a very important thing. You have to give a tree which has a branch length information, or you can give a tree which is a dated time estimated tree. So you have both branch length and a time, and a data which is available only for the extant species. There's no data for the fossils at this point of time, but if you have a tree which also has a fossil for which again you have a branch length information, one can do this. Just to visualize this, this is your tree, again 5 nodes, you have 5 species. What we are doing, again interested in reconstructing the trait value for these 4 ancestors. Now, instead of just optimizing these traits, what we are interested is incorporating the branch lengths here in the model. So these are labeled as T1, T2, T6. These are the branches which lead to the tips what you have here. And there's something called same principle which comes from your models of rate DNA sequence evolution models. If you remember the term called transition matrix. But now what we'll use here is for the trait evolution where we have only 2 traits, right? 0, 1, 1, 0. So Q01 is the rate at which character changes from 0 to 1 over a short interval time dt, and Q10, the rate at which character changes from 1 to 0. As I mentioned, all these branch lengths are calculated, and all the S denotes your ancestors and all the possible combinations for these values. We are interested what would have been the trait value for S6, X7, S8 and S9. This is a very, very similar rate matrix. Any transition or interstaneous rate matrix which describes this transition rates. We have 0, 1, so you minus D1, D1 and D0. And here is where Mesquite, I think, doesn't incorporate all the models, but in R you can think about it. These are the transitions. One can say always 0 to 1, is it equal, or 1 to 0 has more probability. If you have any such information a priori, one can use, but otherwise you can think about all these transitions occurs at an equal rate. You can think about the model which incorporates transition and transversions. It works very, very similarly. One can think all the transitions.
Can I just interject here? If you can go back to the earlier slide. Okay, so people who attended the earlier workshop, this is basically MK1 model, right, Janvi?
Yes, it's MK1.
So this is identical to Jukes Cantor model of sequence evolution, right? So instead of zeros and 0 and 1, you in case of sequence evolution, you have A, T, G, and C along the rows and along the first row and the first column. And the transition matrix basically tells you what is the probability of change and what is the probability of no change. So what is the probability that it remains at 0, 0, and what is the probability that there is a change from 0 to 1. And in case of Jukes Cantor, it will be, what is the probability it remains as A, and what is the probability that it changes from A to G, A to T, A to C, and so on. So this model is very similar to Jukes Cantor, which I think Roy discussed in the last phylogeny workshop. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, because it works in a very, very similar way. And again, as you can think about, if there is any other information you have about these rates, that all transitions occurs at a different rate, the model is called all rates different. But these models, at this present, I'm not sure if Mesquite has, but in R, you can run all these models. And if there are more than 2 transitions, the rate could be symmetric or asymmetric for any reason. If you think loss is more common in given traits than gaining a trait, and you want to specify something like this happens much more than this is a very rare event, you can have a symmetric model. That 0 to 1 occurs at the same rate as 1 to 0, but at a different rate from 0 to 2. If you have a multi-state data. And the model is called symmetric or asymmetric, you can specify that. And then once you run these models, one can use again the AIC framework to select the best model.
I'm sorry, Janvi, can I just interject again?
Sure.
So the ARD model is similar to GTR.
Yes.
Is that oversimplification, or do you think it's similar to GTR?
It's very similar to GTR because all rates are different here. Like you're not assuming that there is any ATGC will have effect on.
And SYM will be something in between ER and ARD, right? Where certain changes occur more often than others and so on.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's just that many times we don't have this a priori information about traits, and maybe this is something you are interested in knowing as well. Then you can run all the 3 models and then select the best. And again, it's exactly same how you will select your model of sequence evolution. You use AIC framework or a BIC framework to look at which is the best model, which explains your data the best. Yeah. And in R, you can do all these 3 things. In Mesquite, I'm not so sure, but I think you can do AR and ER, equal rate model, and ARD. So anyone wants to guess the advantages of likelihood given it's the same principle of likelihood approach. You have a model of sequence evolution to build a tree using likelihood approach. The same set of advantages also there in trait evolution. Does anyone want to guess? You already have a presentation, but do you guys want to guess what have we added from parsimony here? What's the additional information? Branch length, right? You have a branch length information, and it also permits changes along the each branch. It's shown empirically that this performs better with rapidly evolving traits as well as compared to parsimony, and also provides something called variance, estimates of variance and error associated with the trait transitions and your ancestral trait. Instead of putting it as equivocal, we can actually have an associated probability for that ancestral trait.
Danny, can I just interject? Sorry.
Sure.
So I just wanted to mention the branch length point, reiterate the branch length point. In case of parsimony, it's basically just using a cladogram. It does not care a damn about the branch lengths. But we know that if there is a longer branch, the more likely that changes have occurred along those branches because more time has elapsed. And in likelihood methods, it actually takes branch lengths into consideration, and that's why I think it's very important.
No, thanks, Praveen. Yes, and same goes for Bayesian methods as well. So in R, you can use package ape, and the function is called ACE, ancestral character estimation, and you can run all the three models, ER, ARD, as well as symmetric. And there's another package called Jaeger, where you can use the function called fit discrete for any comparative data. And I think fit Jaeger also now has a function for a continuous data. And in Mesquite, the model exactly what we discussed, MKR, MK1 model, Markov K-state parameter 1 model is used, similar to ER. Any questions here? I'll just stop this and I'll do that. So
there's a question in the.
Is it necessary to have time-calibrated trees for tracing? No, it's not. You have a likelihood tree or a Bayesian tree, it's good enough. But if your question demands also looking at, for example, rates, then you'll need a time-calibrated tree. And actually, you can look at the literature. There's a lot of debate on this, like when to use time-calibrated tree and when to not. And I think our understanding is also evolving. But right now, at this stage, no, you don't need to have a time-calibrated tree. You can have a likelihood tree as long as the relationships are resolved and you have a very robust phylogeny which of a whatever level and whatever taxa you're looking at, it should be okay.
Yeah, but you need a phylogram, right?
You need a phylogram. Yes, you need a likelihood or a Bayesian tree.
Janvi, I might have a very silly question. My question is that, I mean, the different traits in an organism are influenced by different genes, right? I mean, when you build a robust tree using, let's say, some gene which might not influence that character, so how can you do?
Yes, thanks. This is the time I would love to clarify this. So your traits are independent of your phylogeny. I think somebody asked yesterday, Chaitanya was also. See, our assumption here is you're building a tree, species tree or whatever family level tree using neutral markers, right? We assume these markers are neutrally evolving and those markers don't have anything to the trait. So for example, if I'm looking at toe pad as a trait in geckos, my tree is based on multiple mitochondrial and nuclear markers, right? I'm not looking at the gene which is responsible or multiple genes which are responsible for the toe pad. So now one can think about it, the gene which is responsible for a toe pad evolution, you can actually trace that particular gene's history using the species phylogeny or a genus phylogeny, whatever it is.
Oh.
Is it clear now? So see, you are interested in understanding how those traits have evolved by using a species hypothesis or a phylogeny which is not built using the markers which are responsible for a trait evolution.
Yeah.
So this is independent.
The gene that gives you the trait, if you build a phylogeny with that, that's not going to depict real evidence.
Yeah.
But you can think in terms of how that gene has evolved using this phylogeny, right? If you have, for example, for a toe pad, just assume a very simplistic scenario. You have only one gene which is responsible for a toe pad structure. And now how that gene has evolved in a group of geckos you can look at. But then it becomes a question of molecular evolution, that how those changes have occurred over a gecko tree.
Yeah.
But you are not using that gene to reconstruct the gecko phylogeny.
Yeah.
Is it clear to everyone? But I think this is a very important point to clear. You are using a phylogeny which is based on neutral markers. They are not under selection, either positive or negative selection. You're assuming that the markers you have used for a tree reconstruction are neutral, or they are accumulating variation neutrally and they are not responsible for a trait evolution.
Yeah, in other words, the marker that you are using to build the phylogeny is independent of the marker responsible for the trait.
Trait.
Yeah. Otherwise,
that's-
what's going to
that's-
happen is you will get, if there's convergence of a particular trait, you'll get the same kind of pattern in the molecular phylogeny. So we have to keep the two separate. Sorry, Chaitanya, you had something to add?
No, I was just saying there's another question, so please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Is there a support value for a trait at a particular node? Yes, you will get a support value. When you do a parsimony, you will either have what trait, like what's the trait value, but when you do a likelihood analysis, you will get a probability, 90.9 probability for this particular trait value to be an ancestor. Same goes for a Bayesian analysis. Aditya was also have a same question. Will it be possible to capture the phenotypically plastic traits? It's interesting to think how to show phenotypic plasticity. Again, you can use it. If one wants to show that these are phenotypically plastic traits, one powerful way to present that, hey, look at this trait, it's phenotypically plastic, and you can show it. Does that make sense? Who asked? Shruti Sengupta. Does that make sense?
But Janvi, traits that exhibit phenotypic plasticity can't be coded as 0 and 1 at the tip.
You can. You can have multi, like 0, 1, 2, 3 could be the trait value for species A.
Yeah, so thereby suggesting that this trait is plastic.
Suggesting this trait is, plastic or polymorphic, whatever way you want to think about it. And how that polymorphism itself has evolved. Then one can think about that. Okay, cool. So now I'll move on to one particular case study where I was involved. So this is the work led by Nikhil Gaitonde, and we looked at all Papilionidae butterflies. This is a one butterfly, huge butterfly phylogeny. And our interest was to understand how these different life history life stages of these butterflies show different color defense strategies. People who are not familiar, this is one of the largest butterfly family with around 600 species of butterflies. These are called swallowtails or parsinines. They're rich in the tropical areas. They have brilliant wing color patterns. Many of them participate in mimicry, in both Mullerian and Betzian mimicry. Do you guys know what are the mimicry, Mullerian and Betzian mimicry? Does anyone want to say what those are? Just unmute yourself and explain. Okay, so Mullerian mimicry is when multiple species converge to the similar color pattern, and it's all in context of butterflies. Mimicry is always in the color and a toxic compounds. So when you have a Mullerian mimics, what it means that multiple species have a similar color pattern and they are also toxic. They are aposematic. That's when it's called Mullerian mimicry. And each species, so it's a mutualistic interaction because all species invest in toxic compound as well as in color pattern. In Betzian mimicry, there's a model and a mimic. So species actually mimics a color pattern of some toxic butterfly, but doesn't produce those toxic chemicals. It's a parasitic interaction, so that mimic is advantageous. So predators think it's a toxic butterfly, and that's how mimic gains an advantage. And it's called Betzian mimicry. So you have to have a model which is toxic, and you just mimic those color patterns, then you become Betzian mimic. And these butterflies participate in both Mullerian and Betzian mimicry. So these two phenomena have been extensively studied in adult butterflies, that which one show Mullerian, which one show Betzian, what are those toxic compounds, and people have studied these two phenomena. And in butterflies, when you think about mimicry, is largely in chemicals as well as in wing color patterns. So given this, and interestingly, we wanted to see that, okay, this is it an individual species level, these traits which species get, or is there a more if one does a comparative analysis, what will we see? So using some of these comparative phylogenetic methods, what we studied is the evolution of color differences in these complex life cycles of Papilionid butterflies. What I mean complex is because you have an egg, then early instar, late instar, pupa, and then adult. So do you have, once you decide what will be your color defense strategy, does it remain static throughout the life cycle or does it change? So particularly what we explored is the relative importance of multiple life history traits, chemical signals, as well as visual backgrounds on which these caterpillars feed. And of course their ancestry and what strategy do they show. So what are these life history categories? So basically these are the 3 stages which they show. One could be aposematic. When we say aposematic, it means it has a warning coloration, but it also has a toxic compound, which is unpalatable to the predator. You can have a cryptic or a camouflage coloring, or you can be masquerading. You can mimic bird dropping, for example, which are equally toxic, but you don't have those toxic compounds. And these caterpillars, both early, late, as well as pupae, show one or the other of these 3 color defense strategies. What are the differences? These 2 stages are mobile. Caterpillars can move because they have to feed. Pupae are immobile, so they are stationary. You go and I'm sure many of you must have seen these pupae, they just hang. And then there's an adult. So we are interested only in these 3 stages and how these color defense strategies might have evolved. So we know now already that defense life history trait, which is at these 2 stages they are mobile, here they are immobile, and what color defense strategy do they show. Apart from these life history traits, what we looked at is what plant do they feed on, because to be an aposematic, these butterflies or caterpillars don't produce this compound, they sequester from a plant they feed upon. So are they feeding on toxic plant or non-toxic plant will determine if they have an aposematic strategy. Growth type, are they feeding on sparse vegetation or a dense vegetation? So that is the visual background on which predator detection also depends upon. And also, where are they distributed? Does that also have an influence? What color strategy would they end up having in the tropical and temperate zones? As I mentioned, these butterflies are largely tropical in like high species richness in the tropic, but also in the temperate region. So does that also have an influence? So we put together the database for each species. What is the life stage phenotype at early, late, and a pupa stage? We coded them. So this is a multi-state data. You can be aposematic, you can be masquerading or cryptic, all 3 strategies. What host plant do you feed upon? Do you feed on toxic or non-toxic? What plant do you feed? Do you feed on shrub, climber, or a tree? And where are you distributed? And this data is available as a supplementary material to the paper. So whoever is interested to look at how the coding has been done, you can look at. And by the way, this entire data set was put together using publicly available information from multiple websites as well as butterfly books. So how we coded this is also explained in great detail in the supplementary material. As I mentioned earlier in one of the slides, we really need to understand what scale we are asking this question. So we realized at a genus level is what is we need to look at, because within a genus, you hardly have a variation in which if a group of species, for example, Papilio as a genus, and within that Menelaidus is one subgenus, most of the species show one type of color defense strategy in their early, late caterpillar stage as well as in pupa stage. So then genus becomes the unit of which we would like to do analysis. So all the major lineages where these characters were consistent within that lineage, that becomes the unit of analysis. So we constructed a Bayesian phylogeny for the family Papilionidae using all the genera for which we had the information, as well as there was a variation within that particular group. All those lineages were represented. Then we used 2 ways of simulating this trait evolution. Remember, we had a trait data. What is the color defense strategy? What is the plant they are feeding upon? And what is the visual background and their distribution? So simple things. What are the ancestral traits for their color defense strategy? So when we looked at early instar, this is the early instar caterpillar which are mapped here. We found that vulnerable stage where they are mobile, species feed on sparsely vegetated become aposematic, the toxic plants. Whereas species which are feeding on densely vegetated non-toxic plants either are masquerading or cryptic caterpillars, right? So masquerading is blue, cryptic is green, and aposematic is orange. You can see what have been the ancestral traits here. So aposematic, and these are, somebody asked, do you have a value associated with it? Yes, the ancestor shows around 75%, it could be aposematic, and green, which is cryptic, was the ancestral trait here. And then we just remember whichever are blue and green here. When we looked at late caterpillars, these remain blue, green. So all the species which were feeding on toxic plants are aposematic, but densely vegetated plants and non-toxic plants either were cryptic or masquerading in their early and late instar stage. But when
Hey, JJ, I have a question.
Sure.
So this is the Bayesian tree, right?
Yes.
Okay. So is phylogenetic uncertainty also taken into account here? Because
yes.
relationships might, there might be
change.
frequency.
Yes. So it's very similar to how you would do the ancestral area reconstruction. You can give multiple tree topologies and then summarize on one tree. That's, you can give 10,000 trees or 100 tree topologies, and then you can
So it takes
reconstruct
the frequency.
Yes.
It takes the frequency of a relationship into
Yes,
account.
of a relationship.
Okay.
Yeah. And Mesquite also does it, as well as R, and also Bayes trait. All three can deal with multiple tree topologies.
Okay.
Hello, ma'am. I have a question here. So how do you think masquerading and cryptic are different?
So cryptic is camouflaging, always with the background, but masquerading need not be with the background, right? It could be bird dropping. In most of the cases, in case of caterpillars, it mimics the bird dropping. It doesn't go with the background necessarily. Cryptic is camouflage.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you had these variation between late and early and late caterpillars. So see, orange remains orange. Once you are aposematic at early, you remain aposematic at late. But when you become pupae, most of them show only green, which is cryptic, camouflaging. So when you are vulnerable, when you are moving, predators can detect you. You have a diversity of color defense strategies. You could show masquerading, cryptic, or aposematic at both. But when you become a pupae, which is non-mobile, you are just going to be in one place when most of the species show cryptic, right? And cryptic coloration then becomes the ancestral state as well, right? Everyone is with me? Understood these two things? Now we are interested in understanding how the other traits which we have quantified, how are they responsible? These are just the traits, right, which are present in these species. This is the early instar caterpillar's trait. It shows cryptic or masquerading or aposematic. But
Janvi, can I just interject? In fact, we don't even need a phylogeny for this, right? We can just say that, early instar, they are either this masquerading or aposematic, and then later on they remain the same. So
it's just that we didn't expect that all of them will show only cryptic. We thought the masquerading and cryptic may show differences in the pupae, but when we looked at the pupae images, we realized every single group just shows cryptic.
Yeah, but then the phylogeny per se is not adding anything to this.
Adding to the third, yes.
But I think the next part of the story, the phylogeny becomes important, right?
Yes, and here also that it's the ancestral trait, right? When we reconstruct, it's just the retention of the ancestral trait. That they just, it's not evolved being a cryptic at every different lineage. Here we have 100% support for being an ancestral trait for a Papilionidae. Now we are interested in understanding how these host plant toxicity and visual backgrounds also predict what color defense strategy these caterpillars and pupae will show. So same phylogeny, what we have now at the tip is the toxic plants and non-toxic plants. So black are non-toxic plants and yellow are all toxic plants. We also had our data from earlier, which are the aposematic and cryptic, which is next to the tip here. All the orange are aposematic, and this is only for the late instar, and a cryptic, which is green. Yeah. And now we want to look at the association. Can these phytochemicals suggest us and give us a clue why you have this? So we did something called phylo-GLMs to understand this neatly. And what we looked at, we also looked at something called tree visual background, right? Are they sparsely vegetated or densely vegetated? So it's a visual background, and which is represented here. This symbol indicates they are non-toxic and trees, sparse vegetation, shrubs, climbers, and toxic plants. So we had also that information. And then we did the phylo-GLMs, which are generalized linear models. Both phytochemicals and visual backgrounds actually strongly predict what color difference phenotype late instar caterpillars will have. So aposematism was favored in the caterpillars feeding on sparsely vegetated toxic host plants, whereas crypsis was favored in the caterpillars feeding on densely vegetated non-toxic plants. Yeah? Is everyone?
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah, so by toxic here, you mean the plant is toxic for the predator that is feeding on that
Yes, yes.
caterpillar,
The
right?
toxic is only meant from a predator's perspective. Yes. So one of the main group of predators for these butterflies are birds, insectivorous birds. So what happens in birds also, there is a learning. When they feed upon these toxic butterflies, they immediately throw, like, they don't eat it. They just pick on it and then they just remove it. So that learning also is very important. So that's how people have looked at what colors and warning coloration is for the predator. Whatever colors you have, yellow, green, blues, which are warning colorations, are meant for predators. And one of the main group of predators for these butterflies is insectivorous birds. And there's other work which shows that, yes, indeed, for birds, these are the colors which indicate these they have toxic compounds.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
So just to put together, these color defense strategies, being a masquerading, crypsip, or cryptic or aposematic at a particular life stage, was determined by interaction of these things. Like, what do you feed upon? Are you mobile or not? And what is your visual background? Are you on a sparsely vegetated tree? And now one needs to really think about, because most of the climbers and shrubs are toxic. Very few trees which are toxic. So we still don't know how to incorporate that information, because this is more of an interaction between these plants only and their habit, which we haven't incorporated here, and their ancestry, of course. So most of the shrubs and climbers are toxic plants. They have the compounds which these butterflies can sequester and become aposematic. The species which feed on densely vegetated are either cryptic or masquerading, don't participate in aposematism. And when you are more mobile, you worry, but when you become immobile, you are only show cryptic, camouflaging as a strategy. But it's an interaction of these three different things: your motion level, phytochemistry, as well as visual backgrounds and ancestry. Yeah?
Janvi, I just wanted to add that in the phylogeny on the top right hand, I see a transition from is it from
Semantic. Yes, one.
to those three just below Pepi low. Yeah, those three. So there is a transition, right?
Yes.
So that is from crypsis to aposematic, and it has moved to feeding on plants that have toxins, I suppose.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. And I must mention, this is nothing to do with the geographic distribution, because we explicitly tested if it's being in the tropic or temperate has an influence, and we didn't find any. So yeah, Praveen, as you said, these lineages are interesting to look at further. When that transition has happened, where do they occur? What's the community in which they live? So there could be again multiple factors which we may not have looked at here, but that needs to be looked at in the area these species occur. Yeah, but at least we could show the transitions from black, which is non-toxic plant, to yellow. Yeah, and the information about the geography is in the color: temperate, which is purple, and tropical, which is blue. And we explicitly looked at in the GLM, and it had no influence on there what defense strategy they have. Yeah, so we basically tried to show it in this little diagram here, like who influences how. So these are your multiple stages. You have egg, then early and late caterpillar, late instar, and adult. We didn't look at eggs and adults because eggs don't show any much of these strategies, and adults have been looked at extensively. So we were just interested in these three different life history stages, how that influenced. And the three things which we looked at are what they feed upon, is it toxic or non-toxic, and also it's a structure, visibility, and motion levels. So one can definitely say that these color defense strategies are determined by the interaction between the life history traits, which are motion levels, phytochemicals, and visual backgrounds and ancestry. And I've circulated this paper with everyone. So if you have any doubts, feel free to ask. But this is a little example. When you know a species life history, one can actually think how that has been determined and what are these factors, and look at the interactions as well as character state evolution. I'll stop this presentation here. But before
Janvi, I just had a quick question. Yeah, when you so again, I think someone, maybe it was Anuj, asked about the toxicity part. So when you say the plant is toxic, clearly it is not toxic to these caterpillars, right? Because they are able to happily feed on them.
Yes.
So when you are saying it is toxic, it is probably toxic to other herbivores other than this caterpillar. These caterpillars are able to, I mean, they have some kind of adaptation that they are able to feed on and sequester the toxin, which then makes it toxic to the predator.
Yeah. So again,
so people have actually looked at the
experimentally.
Oh yeah, okay. Look, I mean, they have actually looked at the plants, what they contain, and
yes. That's enough information on the compounds, the chemistry of those compounds, how it affects birds' digestive system, why they are toxic for the predators. But I must mention the predators which have been extensively studied are birds here, insectivorous birds, and people have done these experiments of cage birds, giving them toxic, non-toxic choice experiments, and what those compounds are, how they actually affect the bird, and why birds don't eat them.
But then sorry, Anuj, we'll come back to you in a minute. My point was that the plants are producing these toxins, so it's against other herbivores, right?
Other herbivores, yes.
Okay,
so that's kind of evolutionary arms race. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
That's like an evolutionary arms race. There's some caterpillars which are able to eat and sequester the compound, but there are some herbivores which they are deterrent to.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Anuj, go ahead.
Yeah, so that is what I wanted to know, because that's a lot of secondary data to be collected if you are like answering such questions. So yeah. Thank you.
No, and it's a complicated also, right? Because a plant is not necessarily targeting only butterfly caterpillars, right?
Yeah.
Because they will have a multiple herbivores. So definitely a community of herbivores which is not eating this, but these caterpillars have an adaptation to actually sequence those compounds and have a warning coloration signature, right? But there will be set of herbivores which will get deterred by, because plants perspective, this will be one of the herbivore, but you will have other herbivores which will not be feeding upon.
Okay.
So Janvi, I had one more question. So the caterpillars that exhibit aposematic coloration, in their adult form, are they also aposematic?
Aposematic, yes, they remain aposematic. Yes.
Okay, because I mean, all those chemicals are still there in their
Still
body.
there. Yeah, still
Okay,
there in the body. Yeah, we haven't looked at adults because adults are the ones which the non-aposematic ones again show a very different color defense strategy, and there is a lot of polymorphism there. So we didn't get into the adult because then we'll need a species level data, not at a genus, because there's a lot of polymorphism there.
JJ, there's a question in the chat box by Prashant.
Okay, one sec. I'll go to the chat box. In one of the lineage, there is aposemata in the larvae on non-toxic plants. Would you please explain that? Yes, I think it's a Apocynaceae plant family. And we do mention that very separately in the either our discussion or in the supplementary material. And there is a lineage, there is a crypsis in larvae feeding on a toxic plants. Yes. So see, these are the examples which you will get, but what is the overall picture when you're looking at these 22 genera and what is this? And our interest was, is it because of the ancestry and where all these changes have occurred? And now one can actually go back once you have this macro scale picture, look at these cases very specifically. Okay, the sister lineages show this particular trait. It becomes really interesting now to look at and go back and ask this question. Why do you see a crypsis here? Are there much more local contemporary processes which driving then the dynamics there? Right now you know at the macro scale picture that, okay, one particular lineage, there's something shift has happened, which is not because of their shared ancestry. They're showing the shift and what could be the potential reasons and drivers for that particular shift in that particular landscape. So when you do such a large scale studies, what it gives you more questions which one can understand at a lineage level, within a species or within a group of species. Is it clear?
I just wanted to add that, you know, what you have done here is sort of look at broad scale patterns.
Yes. Yes.
And we see some interesting patterns there, and there will always be interesting exceptions within that broad pattern. And then, as you rightly pointed out, that's when you sort of, you know, design another more specific study to figure out, you know, what's really going on. Why is this thing, you know, behaving differently? But one has to do these, you know, large scale sort of analyses to figure out what are the broad scale patterns.
Yeah. And actually, when we started this work, we were surprised that this wasn't done, because these are the butterflies which have been studied for literally more than 100 years. And people have observed. So we have for some species, you even have a population level information. If there is a polymorphism, people have noted that polymorphism at a species level.
Okay. Now I got it. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so these kind of studies are in the domain one can call macroecological, macroevolutionary. So your aim is to look at what is the predominant pattern when you look at Papilionidae as a family. So most interesting, which is not a very meaning, like you'll see why does one need it, but is the pupa. We really didn't expect that across 22 genera, you will have one particular strategy when you show such a variation at early and a late instar. And it's across lineages, nothing happening unique about one lineage. They show aposematism or masquerading cryptic, but once you become pupae, it's only cryptic. And this kind of a dynamics, except couple of cases which are unique, you have a very consistent pattern. Yeah, so the last two slides are nothing but more information on how does one go about doing ancestral trait reconstruction. And this example, I showed ancestral trait reconstruction, but also how do you look at associated traits. And you can think about any other hypothesis which you would like to test and what are the most appropriate methods. Here are the tutorials which are very useful, which are, at least I found it very useful. So I'm just giving you the links of those tutorials, and which have a much more detailed information on these sort of questions. I'll just stop here. And all of you have a copy of this presentation, right? So what I'll do now is show you a demo of Mesquite. How does one use Mesquite as a software to look at trait evolution? I'm assuming all of you were able to download Mesquite and run it on your computers. But if you have any problem, please put it in the chat box or in the WhatsApp group. So I'm going to show you Mesquite now. Again, Mesquite has a very detailed web page. It's called Mesquite Project, which you can check it out. And also in the WhatsApp group, I have shared a tutorial, a step-by-step, what I'm going to show you now. So if you can't follow it here, you can always go back to the tutorial. Can everyone see a Mesquite screen?
It's loading, JJ.
Yes.
Yeah. So Mesquite looks at character data, tree data differently, like how any biogeography software also. You can store your character data as .csv file and a tree files as .tre files. You can have a NEVIC format, Nexus format. Yeah, any format is fine for that. I'm going to open the character data here first. These files have been circulated, so you should have a copy of that. And I'm keeping the names exact. What I'm showing here is the file name .txt.next is the character data. You can see the character matrix here. I'm just going to say show matrix. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, it's visible. JJ, is it possible to increase the font slightly, or
I'll try.
If it's not possible, it's okay. Anyway, people can go through the video.
So I'll just show, can you see my cursor here? So this is a species name and this is the character state. I'm just trying to see if I can increase the, no, I can't. I'm sure there must be a way.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. So, but you have a species names and character data. And as everyone has been telling you that species names which are in your phylogenetic tree has to match exactly what's there in the character data. So you can't have different names here. It has to exactly match. In R, it's extremely easy to just get your taxa labels from the tree and just use that for the character data to create your matrix. And these are your character data. Here also you can edit, you can type in, or you can give a CSV file and then read it. It's really up to you. What I'm going to see, okay, this character data looks perfect. This is exactly how I wanted it. Same Menderosa species has one character, is how it's reading. So I'm happy with this. I'm going to open now tree file, which is my tree, which has all these taxa.
JJ, can I just stop you for a minute?
Sure. Yeah.
So Prashant is not able to use his microphone. So he has a question that he's not able to ask. So he wants to ask how the larvae become toxic even if it is feeding on the non-toxic plant.
So see, right now our definition of toxic and non-toxic, as Praveen was asking earlier, is based on the phytochemistry background, like based on those compounds. But there are these examples where actually there are shifts within the host plants also, which these species show, and then they get these toxic compounds. That's your question, right? Larvae feed on non-toxic plants and also get these aprosomatins. So there will be 1 or 2 compounds which are right now not, that particular tree species is not classified as a toxic based on their profiling, but 1 or 2 compounds may be contributing to becoming toxic. And we don't have that data yet. And wherever, I think there was only one such case where there is aposematism in larvae. How can we create character matrix as an access format? You can see CSV file, open the CSV file in Mesquite and save it as an access format. Aritra, right? That's what you asked. How do you can read a CSV file as well. .txt file.
Got it.
Or you can actually get your tree, get the tree labels and enter your data in Mesquite. That's also possible. Whatever works. It really depends how big is the data set and how much time you want to invest. So then the third step is link this character data with a tree file, where I'm going to open the tree file.tre.nexus. Again, you can get it from Figtree, you can get it in Mesquite. On your left-hand side, it shows you all the files you have opened. So we have one character matrix and we have imported trees. You can say view trees. Can everyone see this?
It's visible.
So this is your tree topology, right? And as Chaitanya has mentioned yesterday and Roy earlier, see, it's very tempting to do these analysis. It's very easy to do, but one need to keep thinking or ponder over what are your characters, at what level are you analyzing, is it the most appropriate level, what's your question, and then do this. It's doing the analysis is extremely straightforward. The most of the time is spent on what characters, what traits, at what level. Am I analyzing this data at a species level because that's where the trait values change, or is it at a genus or a family level? So that's the place where you will invest most of your time. Doing these analyses are very straightforward and easy. So here there's an option called analysis tree, and I think in Windows it will be different. It will be only analysis, but I think in Mac it shows analysis tree. What we are interested is trace character history, which is the second tab. I'm just going to click on that. And as I mentioned, you have a parsimony, likelihood, as well as stochastic character mapping, which is equivalent of SimMap in Mesquite. We will do only parsimony ancestral trait. This is your character 1, and it tells you how these characters are distributed in the phylogeny, what's the color code 1, 2, and 3, and how are they distributed in the phylogeny. At a tip, you can see this, and what's the evolutionary pattern. So on the bottom box, I don't know how to give this information, but you have these results. Like it tells you how many terminal taxa are there. You can highlight whichever you want, the lineage. And Roy also asked, can I do it on one tree or can I incorporate phylogenetic uncertainty? And in Mesquite, yes, you can. And that's what trace character shows. Is it character 1 or you have multiple characters? Or can I give 100 trees or 10,000 trees and give a summary tree in which consensus of this trait evolution is shown? So it's really up to you. Yeah. So this is the node and I get most parsimonious states. Can you see that? Whenever we go and put our cursor on that particular branch or a node, you get most parsimonious states for that node. Yeah?
Visible.
Visible. Can you see?
Yeah.
The most. So there will be clades in which parsimony gives you equivocal 1 or 2 versus only 2 or 3, right? We saw that. And this is the same exact algorithm which Mesquite uses. You can also use likelihood method, and it has a MK1 model which is equivalent to equal rate. Again, trace character history, likelihood ancestral state, say okay. What is the probability model, current, and it gives you all the details here. It's a category where data, likelihood calculations currently required. state distribution to include only continuous states. So it will say you can't do. Your character states only with state 2, 3 are not allowed. So you have to have a binary data. We'll say, okay, we will not run it. We will stick to our parsimony analysis. But in R, you can do this. But it's still going ahead and correcting it, but it gave you alert. It's calculating the likelihood, but it's now going to tell me only 1 and 2 and not 3 states.
Oh, so Janvi, let me get this straight. So in case of Mesquite, it does likelihood, but as long as it is just binary, only 2 character states.
Data, yeah. But in R, you can have a multi-state data. Yes.
Okay. And continuous data also, what about R? I'm sure Mesquite won't be able to deal with it, right?
But in R, you can do it.
R, you can do that, yeah.
Is everyone clear? It's extremely easy to do. And Mesquite is also a software you can play with your tree topology. If you want to remove certain things, you can remove those tree topologies. You can go to tree and look at all those things. How do you alter, transform tree, add a taxa, remove taxa, root, unroot. So it's one of those softwares where you can actually look at your tree topology from multiple ways and do these manipulations if required.
And in Mesquite, you can also combine data sets. So if you have separate, mitochondrial and nuclear data sets, and if you want to combine it, one way of combining it is, you open one of the data sets and then copy and paste each and every sequence from the other data set onto, your current data set and come up with a combined data set, which can be very laborious. But in Mesquite, you can just combine the 2 data sets into one. So there is a command somewhere. I've seen someone do that.
So just want to show you one more. So this is the Mesquite web page. Can you see, all of you?
Visible,
yeah.
visible.
Yeah, visible.
Yes,
so,
yes.
So these are the details. What we just did, studying the history of character evolution. What is the methods? What is the data matrix? How do you create your data matrix? What exactly are the algorithms each of these methods is going to use? When you click on parsimony, what it means. So this is the explanation of parsimony reconstruction methods. What it means, what model is it using? What sort of output will you get? When you say likelihood, how you go about it? What is the transition matrix? Can we actually edit this transition matrix? In Mesquite, no. You have only one NK model, which is equal rate. So 0 to 1, 1 to 0. And it's actually mentioned here. And you can also do asymmetric. Remember that symmetric model we talked about? You can give that here. Which is again a very similar to what we did in historical biogeography analysis, right? Remember, we built those transition metrics for the dispersals. Do you keep value 1, or do we know that this area to A to B, is it more possible versus the reverse if we know the wing current? So it's the same transition. The way we think about transition metrics, it remains very, very similar. Here you are thinking about trait states, 0 to 1. Right? And Mesquite has these detailed pages of explaining every single thing, which is a very, I feel it's a very useful thing when you are actually going over it. How to interpret your data, what it means, how do you export these trees, what format, how do you store your data. So Mesquite has an excellent notes for that. And it's called Mesquite project. I can just copy paste this link and put it in the chat box so you can check it out.
Hey JJ, for the data set that you're using, do you have R codes that you can potentially send to people?
Yeah, we can send it to people as well as they are up on the, along with the paper as supplementary materials. But yes, I'm happy to send it across. I'll put it on the WhatsApp group. Yeah. See what trait you use and what level. So I'm just going to repeat myself here, but sorry for this, because see, doing these kind of analysis, as I said, these programs with a great GUI is easy. way to do it, but what taxa and what trait and why does it interests you? What is your question? Is something you really need to think through. Trait could be anything. Somebody asked if I can use coat pattern in mammals. Yes, one can, but at what scale? What mammals are you going to look at? Does it vary within a species or within a genus or within a family? So these, again, genus, species, family is something all of us are familiar with, but within a lineage, what's the variation? Is it very polymorphic trait, or a group of mammals are going to be very similar in their trait value? These are the questions you need to ask, and what is your question and what sort of data set would be required to ask that question?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I felt at least the last day we dealt with a relatively easy topic.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Janvi just said. Often what happens is we look at all these cool tools and we are like, oh, I want to do that. And so our research becomes more tool-based. I'm like, oh, I want to do genomics. I want to do character evolution. I want to, date the phylogeny. These are just tools to understand, various processes that have occurred out there. So you have to, instead of just going after tools, you should first come up with an interesting question and then ask yourself what tools should be used to address that question, right? So that's very important. And we have talked about applications of molecular phylogenetics. In many of the cases, maybe even a phylogeny is not needed, right? So I would urge all of you to, first think about what kind of tools one should use to address a particular question that you are interested in, and then decide on what methods to use, instead of going after the tools first and then thinking about the question, which is completely a reverse way of looking at things, and it's not going to take you very far, because it'll be a complete mess. And if you just say, okay, I'm just going to use Mesquite to address some interesting question, then you'll be in deep waters and you'll have no clue what to do with it. So yeah, just think about the question and then decide on what tools to use.
Yeah, I'm done. If you have any questions about Mesquite or any such thing, or overall the workshop, I think we still have some time to address those. Because Mesquite is one of the easiest software to run, and it has GUI as well as excellent notes. And it also has a workflow. So that's why I have highlighted the workflows here, what Praveen was talking about. Managing molecular data, continuous data, interactions with other programs. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can maybe have a question answer and feedback session, since we have about half an hour left.
Yes, yes. So I'll stop presenting and I've put the link to the Mesquite project where the notes are, the link.
Ma'am, I have one question.
Sure.
Ma'am, characters are product of both genetic as well as environmental factors, right?
Yes.
So, ma'am, in some cases, what if because of environmental factors, the character states have changed, but in phylogeny, the species has been same, like different, because of different character states, the species in phylogeny is reflecting as the same. So, how to deal with that?
Can you repeat your question? If I understand it correctly, you're saying a species shows a certain trait, and how. So, and I know what are the closely related species to that. So I'll take an example again, Hemidactylus geckos. If I have 3 gecko species, one species has complete lamellae on its toe pad, other has only half, and one does not have. They are not divided. One is fully divided, one is partially divided. So now I want to understand, is it to do with the habitat? So that becomes my question. I'm not using the genes which code for a lamellae or a toe pad. My trait evolution here is how these 3 characters have evolved in these three species. And I know how they are related to each other, which is the species sister to each other. All these A, B, and C species, I know C is sister to A and B are sister to one another. That's a plain. And I have a trait data. Now I want to know what was the ancestral state for those lamellae in Hemipterus geckos. Was it complete, partial, or lack of divided lamellae? Yeah. So then I will look at all those three. So that's the exercise which we did. And you can have a now hypothesis because of the habitat, it had changed. Then you look at those species across habitats, look at the character states, and then look at the association between them.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Praveen, or anyone want to add to that?
Oh, I'm not sure I understood her question.
I think I rephrased her question in my head and I answered.
So my question is like, because of environmental factors, the species might show little variation, like in their shape or maybe color. But in phylogeny, those species are coming as same species. So how we will study character in this, like character states in such species?
Yeah, so I mean those characters are probably plastic within species or exhibit polymorphism.
Yeah,
right?
Yes, sir. Polymorphism.
As Janvi mentioned earlier, polymorphic characters can be coded as, so for example, if there are two states for that character, right? One is dark coat color, the other one is light coat color. So you can code dark coat color as 1 and light coat color as 0, and for that species at the tip of the phylogeny you put in 0 and 1, not only 0 or only 1, right? And most programs will be able to deal with that. So that's basically telling the program that, look, this character is polymorphic. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. So we have to put it manually, you mean, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, how else? I mean, everything has to be provided by the investigator, right? I mean, how is the program going to know? And whatever inference it's going to, whatever result it's going to spit out, it all depends on what information you give the program.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in right here. So, I mean, there's a lot of background work, obviously, that you need to do before you start such a study. So, for example, if you're describing a species, you're not describing an individual, right? You're describing a population. So, therefore, ideally, you should describe all the variations within that population, which is the whole idea behind having a type series, right? So, you have a holotype and then you have paratypes, right? So you're assuming that that kind of covers all the variation in traits. You might have morphological traits that slightly vary within the same species across the population. So you'll have to take all these into account as well.
Yeah, and I must mention here that characters you have to measure. The character data you will measure. So again, I'm going back to the amphibian or reptile example. You have a snout to length. And as Roy mentioned just now, you have when you have a population level trait data, you can also give a variation which is associated with the trait while you give your input trait data for a continuous trait. You don't give a one fixed value. You can give a mean, or you can give a mean and associated variation for a trait data. And most of the programs are also able to handle that variation data. But mostly in R, you can give that for a continuous trait and also for a multi-state. But again, the trait data you have to measure or you have to code.
Yes.
Yeah, are there any other questions from yesterday, day before yesterday also you can ask? We have some couple of minutes.
So I had a question from yesterday's session while studying the coalescent and what was it, divergent tree, those things. So Chaitanya sir mentioned that in one particular software uses both of them. So I just wanted to know how both of them are considered in the similar analysis. Sorry, same analysis, given that they are opposite in their methodology. One goes from tip to the root, and one goes from root to the tip.
Yeah, so they're not used together, right? So the phylogeny that you use is first subjected to the birth rate model, and probabilities are calculated, and then the same phylogeny is subjected to the coalescent model, and then probabilities are calculated.
Okay, so you mean separately?
Separately, and then
it's not that one clade uses coalescent and one clade uses the other one.
Sorry, simply.
But the entire tree goes through one model, and then.
Yeah, that makes the most sense, right? Because for each node, you need to find out if the node is explained better by speciation or intraspecific divergence, right? For every node in the phylogeny.
Yeah.
It's not like a single. And from yesterday, I want to make one correction. I went through the video yesterday. I think Praveen asked me if BPTP uses birth, death, and coalescence. It actually does not. I was mistaken. It uses the Poisson tree process, which is a completely different methodology. So that's one correction I want to make from yesterday.
Again,
yeah, right. So Chaitanya, again, coming back to Shabnam's question. So it uses birth date model on the tree, and then independently uses coalescent model on the tree. And then how are the results from these two sort of analyses combined? Any thoughts on that?
No, in the sense that it's completely invisible to us, right? In the sense we really don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So I'm actually told that this it's a combination of these things. For example, GMYC, it first just runs the whole tree through the coalescent approach, right?
Yeah.
So if all the nodes in the phylogeny are explained really well by coalescent, as in all the nodes have a very high posterior probability after you run it through coalescent, GMYC will not even bother to use the birth rate model because it's all intraspecific divergence according to it. See what I mean, right? However, if certain deeper nodes are not explained well by the coalescent, then it even bothers to run the combined model. So some of them just do that. They just run it through the coalescent, and then they figure out if they actually need to run it through the birth rate at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello, I have one question.
Hey, Aritra, before that, did you figure out the effective ancestral population sizes for X chromosome?
Yeah, I got an answer. But
Thanks for asking, Chaitanya.
So I got intrigued by that question. I was trying to do the math myself yesterday, and so I came up with an answer. So what's yours?
Mine is 0.625.
How did you get there?
Yeah, for female. Yeah, for
you
female.
Basically took an average of male and female individuals.
Yeah. I have done an average.
Okay, cool. Yeah, pretty much the same. Okay, cool. Yeah. All right.
Hey, wait. What's the answer?
0.65.
625.
625. No, I don't think so. It should be 0.75.
So Praveen, it's 0.75 if you're sequencing from a female individual, and it's 0.5 if you're sequencing from a male individual. That's the effective ancestral population size. So he's taken an average of 0.75 and 0.5.
Yeah, he's taken an average of.
Yeah, I have taken an average.
Oh, okay. Fine. Anyway, Aritra, you had a question?
Yeah. That program BPTP and the other one that estimates number of species. So that uses a single gene tree for that estimation, right?
Yes.
And suppose I have 4 to 5 genes under analysis. So in that case, should I feed separate gene trees to get the estimated number of species? Or
so use the best resolved gene.
Okay.
The gene with the best resolution. And if you're doing, obviously you're looking at species level phylogenies, So it's okay to use a mitochondrial gene there, right? Which is likely to be better resolved.
Yeah. And as you, if you see more empirical studies, you will see the same thing. People usually use SIDBI or COI. Again, if one wants to make a conservative estimate, use protein coding marker than ribosomal marker is what also.
Yeah, so actually, these tools were introduced mainly for
COI.
barcoding thing.
Barcoding marker. So for COI were the ones.
Yeah. So these tools were primarily introduced for that. So they work very well in barcoding type scenarios.
Okay. Got it. Thanks.
One more question. What I wanted to know is, in any of these analysis, it be biogeography or character evolution analysis, it has nothing to do with how many genes we used to build a phylogeny, right? It is completely up to us that how we get the resolution. May it be one gene or multi-gene, and then we go ahead with further analysis.
Yes. But having a robust phylogeny is essential to do any of such analysis. And if there is uncertainty, you need to retain that. As Roy asked today also, that can we retain that phylogenetic uncertainty if it's there? Can we reconstruct scenarios using multiple tree topologies?
But if I have a unresolved tree, I mean polytomies and all, and if I subject it to such analysis, how the output would be, how robust the output would be?
See, the problem is your premise itself is uncertain, right? So you can't take the output at face value at all.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So what one can also do, but coming back to, I know Roy also has something to say here, and we'll get back to him in a bit. Coming back to your first question, and as Janvi pointed out, these programs have no way of knowing, if this is the right phylogeny or if this phylogeny is messed up or whatever, right? It will just take whatever phylogeny you give the program. You have to be confident about your phylogeny. And obviously, more markers, better. So if your phylogeny is just based on one or two markers, most most journals will say, well, do you have absolute confidence in your phylogeny? Because all the inference downstream is going to be based on that phylogeny, right? So more markers, definitely better. The general sort of consensus now that is emerging is between 10 to 20 nuclear markers gives pretty robust phylogenies. However, even there might be certain taxa that are moving about, and you have multiple equally parsimonious trees, or multiple phylogenies that have likelihood scores that are very, very similar, not identical. Then the question is, what do you do? Some of these programs take that uncertainty, or phylogenetic uncertainty, into consideration while doing the ancestral reconstruction, either of areas or character. The other approach is, say you get two trees, right? And they are quite similar, but there are a few changes, differences between the two. Use both the trees, run two separate analyses, right? And see if the result is very different or not. Often, whatever question you are trying to address, these minor changes in the phylogeny does not make a difference. Okay, so that is my answer to your question. So first of all, try to get a robust phylogeny, well-supported phylogeny, good bootstrap support, and if there are certain nodes that are unresolved, then you can always run multiple analyses where that particular species which is causing confusion is placed in different parts of the phylogeny, and you run the analysis based on that, and maybe it doesn't really change the big story. Okay.
So basically, from what I understand is, we have to, we cannot just completely depend on the software. We have to have a strong base about our group, and how sure we are about the tree and then we can go ahead with the analysis. The more confident we are about the initial tree, the more robust we get our final analysis, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Correct. And I just wanted to resonate what Praveen said. I think you started off by saying that you get if you use one single gene, you'll get a particular tree. You use a bunch of genes, you'll get another tree. So single gene phylogenies or two gene phylogenies, I mean, it's pretty much you can't really publish these anymore. Also, if you use a single gene phylogeny, you're basically looking at the evolutionary history of that one gene. So that's not really going to tell you much. So ideally, you would want to start off with a robust phylogeny. Okay. The second part of your question was about polytomies. Now, remember that you will have polytomies only when you're doing a consensus of multiple trees which might have discrepancies. You will not have polytomies if there is any discrepancy between the trees, right? So, for example, in Bayesian analysis, you're looking at the trees in the posterior distribution, right, and the saturation, right? Now, these trees are not just different in their topology. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be different in terms of their topology. Topologically, they can be same, but their branch lengths might be different. So therefore, these trees are different. So what Mr. Bayes does is it calculates a 50% majority rule consensus tree, right? Which is where you might get polytomies. But most of these programs for character evolution and biogeography analysis, what they do is they take phylogenetic uncertainty into account. So therefore, you feed in a lot of trees, and if there's uncertainty in a particular relationship, that will show up. Alternately, when you're doing a maximum likelihood analysis, it will give you only one tree with the highest likelihood. So if you're absolutely confident about that tree, if you think that it is robust enough, so then you can just use that tree for further analysis.
Just to repeat what everyone else has said, get your whatever species, genus, family tree in place, which is well resolved, and then think about historical biogeography analysis or a species tree or character evolution. But none of these programs will tell you that how good or bad this tree topology is. That's your call.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording.